Hello and a very warm welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. The armies of the world's two most populous nations are locked in a standoff in the Himalayas. India and China have moved armies on the LAC and also heavy machinery. US President Donald Trump seems to be upset with what's happening and has also offered to mediate and try to bring peace on the border. There are several other dynamics really as far as China's conflicts with the world are concerned, and that's what we're going to discuss on this edition of The Big Picture. Joining me on the program today are Lieutenant General S.L. Narasimhan, retired member, National Security Advisory Board; Jayadeva Ranade, security and intelligence expert; and Vivek, Katju, former ambassador. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. General, let me begin the program with you first. There are so many dimensions, really. I'm going to take them up one by one. So I'm going to ask my guests to be brief so that we can try and squeeze in as much as we possibly can in the next half an hour. So first, let's talk about President Trump's, offer to try and mediate between India and China. That offer has been rejected by both India and China. What do you make of that?
This is not the first time that President Trump has offered to mediate. He earlier also said that he'll be able to mediate between India and Pakistan. But I think India has always maintained that India-China relations and India-Pakistan issues are bilateral. As it is, even in this issue, we have already been talking to each other, and I'm sure we'll be able to handle it in that manner.
All right. And Ambassador, let me bring you in now. All that's been happening really as far as India and China is concerned. China has upped the ante. It seems the rhetoric has been taken up to a new high as well. What's the end game as far as China is concerned?
First of all, Frank, I must say I'm privileged to be on a panel with two truly great China experts. The thought which is coming to me recurringly is, if this is an action which is limited to the dynamics of the line of actual control, or whether this is something more than that. We've had standoffs in the past. The last was in Doklam, but this seems to me to be qualitatively different. And it seems that the Chinese, perhaps on account of the infrastructure development on our border, which is perfectly legitimate as far as we are concerned, and I think it is our right to do it, are asserting their perception of the LAC. Now, if it is limited only to this, then of course it is a tactical move with strategic dimensions. But if this is more than that, then it assumes completely new dimensions, because the Chinese at the moment are under great pressure externally on account of the handling of COVID-19.
Okay, all right. Mr. Ranade, would you look at this as localized incidents, or is it part of a bigger plan really as far as China is concerned? Because they've been aggressive in the South China Sea, and also they've taken an aggressive stand really as far as some of the other countries around the world are concerned.
Well, let me follow up from what Vivek just said about China being under pressure from other countries. So the point is that despite that pressure, they have decided to open this front. That is the first point that I would like to make, which indicates that there has been a lot of planning. This entire development has to have been approved by the very top. That means by Xi Jinping, who, of course, people lightly call him chairman of everything, but he's certainly the commander-in-chief and chairman of the military commission. And it comes down to the Western Theatre Command and 3 military sub-districts. So it's a coordinated, well-planned action which has taken place. The general, I'm sure, will be able to expand on that more, but as far as I'm aware, this is how it is. Third, the moment if I may call it, intrusions or face-offs or physical fisticuffs happened at Nakula and later on at Galwan and later on Pangong. The day they happened, the same day, there were articles published either in the Global Times or on China's social media which justified China's claim or justified China's action the same day. As far as the Galwan Valley is concerned, they stated unequivocally that that is Chinese territory and has always been. That is their claim. The other article, when there was an incident at Pangong So, reiterated their claim made earlier in April 2013 that the entire Ladakh belongs to them. The point I'm trying to make is that it was planned, whereas the rest of the Chinese media has had very, very few articles, I think 3 or 4, on the entire issue, but it is their social media which has published some articles, and they all seem to be from one single source. It's like one person sitting and making a draft, and then maybe with minor changes, it appearing elsewhere. So it is certainly a planned action. It is not a one-off action by some local commander, which mistake people had made earlier when they looked at other incidents. So it is a coordinated action, and it is happening despite the huge anti-China sentiment in the world today. So it's a conscious decision. Why it is taken, etc., we'll discuss, I'm sure, as the program goes along.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right. So, General, since we are here, what's different this time around? Because both speakers, the ambassador as well as Mr. Ranade, have pointed out that things are very different in May 2020. What is different, and why is it different?
I would say there are 3 points that we need to look at. One is that earlier, when the face-offs took place, they were one-off, in the sense that if it took place in, say, Depsan, the other areas were not actually activated. This time around, 3 areas are concurrently going. One is Nakula in Sikkim, the other one is Pankungso, and the third one is in Galwan Valley. That is number 1. Number 2, I also agree with Mr. Jayadeva Ranade when he says that it is being planned at a higher level. Basically, because these are actually geographically well separated areas into which these actions have been taking place. Therefore, a local commander would not have been able to orchestrate this kind of a thing. Obviously, at least at the Western Theatre level command, Western Theatre command level, this would have been coordinated. And I am sure the CMC, if not earlier, at least later would have come into picture, and therefore that is the way it is. That is the second thing. The third thing that comes up is that the numbers in which they have come in. If you take Dipsangbal, if you take others, other than Doklam, this is one of the face-offs in which we find the numbers of PLA are more. The second, the third point is that the fisticuffs which Mr. Jayadeva Ranade referred to, they have been more aggressive. There have been more injuries. It is not that without precedent that this happened. In Pankungso in 2017, again there was stone pelting, etc. Again, there were people who got injured, but this time around, the aggressiveness seems to be a bit more. So I would say these are the 3-4 points which are different from what has been happening earlier.
And I want to take up another aspect with you, General. There are some media reports that talk about how there are several air bases that have come up along the LAC or very close to the border with India. How big of concern is that?
Firstly, Gargunsa is already an existing airport. That is the first point. Secondly, what has happened is that in Tibet, China was planning to upgrade 7 airfields. Gargunsa happens to be one of them. So it could very well be part of the 7 airport that were to be developed that this has happened, but probably it has happened at the wrong time when the other issues are happening along that border. That is the second. The next point is that the number of aircraft that are there on that airfield. You find that Gargunsa is an airfield which has been operational earlier also. Now the reports have come out that the J-11 aircraft is being placed there, and that is something that is, again, it is not new. This is the exercise period time. The aircraft moving around this time to do exercises. So again, that will not be anything new. But again, it has happened at a time when the border face-offs are taking place. So that is how it has probably got highlighted.
Okay, all right, Ambassador, let me take up another issue now with you. Of course, the military aspects have been spoken about. Add to that the language of the Chinese diplomats all around the world. Is that something that surprises you? Because they too have taken a very aggressive stand.
Well, that is a little surprising because there is no longer any sobriety in the language of the Chinese diplomats responding to criticism of China in respect of COVID-19. There is no doubt that the pandemic began in China. There is also no doubt of its origin, but whenever there is a criticism or even a call for an inquiry, then the Chinese diplomats have descended to what I would call most undiplomatic language and stance, and even a coercive language. You take the example of Australia. Not only did the Chinese ambassador to Australia use very intemperate language, he also warned the Australians of economic consequences which have been backed with certain action from China. So I think this is a time when the Chinese leadership is trying to show to their own people and to the world that China remains strong and that China will assert its rights. Now, this particular action, if I may correlate it, seems to me to be an indication to us clearly that look, don't take us for granted at this time, don't think that we are weak. And it is also a signal to South Asia as a whole to, to really indicate to South Asia the differences in the power equation between India and China.
All right. So taking this point that the ambassador is making forward with you, Mr. Ranade, and also adding to what the general said, he spoke about timing. The timing can't be a coincidence, can be, because it seems to be very well orchestrated. But why now?
Well, I would look at two things, frankly. The first is the domestic situation inside China, where Xi Jinping has been under a lot of pressure. In fact, it is virtually unprecedented in China for an incumbent party chief and therefore chief of China to be asked to step down and to be named in the criticism, which is what we have been seeing happening, especially since March of 2018, which is when, as you are aware, he abolished the term limits on the top posts, which is what incensed a lot of people. Secondly, the Chinese Communist Party has also been criticized by name, thereby undermining its, shall I say, legitimacy or its authority. This got a fillip after the COVID outbreak in Wuhan. And they were accused of mishandling the outbreak. And at that time, a lot of other criticism came out, blaming Xi Jinping for the extremely stringent and restrictive security measures that he has put in place, for the party surveillance on academics, intellectuals, and students that have been brought in, etc. There are a number of points that were made by them. The point to note is that people engaged in this criticism through the social media, knowing full well that they will be traced and punished, which has happened. But they were willing to take that risk, and it included party cadres, officials, one at least member of their Supreme Court judge, etc. So this was the extent of criticism. The third point was the impression gaining ground in China that the leadership had lost its grip on the so-called reunification of China or rejuvenation of China, which they were propagating. He had said that by 2021, the China dream will be achieved. Now that has many components, but one of them is to reunify China. And here they see that Hong Kong, which had already come to China in 1997, is now slipping away with the regular protests and no action by Beijing. Second, a pro-independence political party has come to power in Taiwan, again a setback for them. Third, no progress in the South China Sea or Yellow Sea. So there was this impression. This would be the backdrop to all this. And finally, as far as India specifically is concerned, there has been a growing concern about India. And it's been growing for some time. In fact, I would suggest that this concern, this worry about India, and particularly this government, started even before Doklam. But then Doklam happened. There was a disengagement where the Chinese saw the Indian army holding firm, the Indian political establishment holding firm. And in fact, when the disengagement happened, there was a backlash against Xi Jinping inside China, which also lingers, particularly in the memory of the army, I'm sure, who must be, and that particular general was supposed to be an outstanding general. So it must have lingered in their mind. They're all around. And now, at this time, Xi Jinping may have thought that let us not only test out our army, but also teach India a very minor lesson, but a small one. But on our part, the fact that it has happened, as the general correctly pointed out, it has happened in 5 or 6 places. It indicates that they have stretched the points of conflict or points of tension to different places, indicating it's not a localized thing and putting us not only under pressure, but I think making us think that possibly there is something more to come. That is how I would look at it, that this is not the end of it. So I'll stop there. Get back to it.
Certainly, this is not the end of it. There's a lot more needs to be done. Really, what needs to be done and how do we diffuse the standoff is something that I'm going to take up a little later in the program. But before that, let me talk about a couple of aspects that Mr. Ranade raised about Hong Kong and Taiwan. You know, General, how much of a concern is what is happening in Hong Kong and Taiwan in mainland China, and how much of a problem is it for Xi Jinping?
Hong Kong issue actually started last year when they were trying to introduce a fugitive bill in the Hong Kong Legislative Council. And the trigger for that was one of the Taiwanese persons did a murder in Hong Kong and went back to Taiwan. And from then onwards, you find that the protests have been increasing in strength and increasing in violence. COVID came and then the things got suppressed. But this kind of an opposition from Hong Kong also took the Chinese government by surprise. And there were other connotations to this. If Hong Kong is not able to be administered properly the way it is supposed to be, the one country, two systems that they were trying to propagate is not going to be effective, and people are not going to actually believe that the system will work. So therefore, it is going to affect Taiwan also, because Xi Jinping has also offered the country two systems to Taiwan also last year. So that is also likely to be affected. Third thing is, in case this thing is generally found to be an effective method of actually countering the government, and if such a protest happens in, say, mainland, how do you deal with this? Fourth is, the way the government handled Hong Kong. If they were harsh, again there would be repercussions. If they are lenient, again there would have been repercussions for the mainland government. So they were actually caught between the frying pan and the fire. So this is something, it has been affecting them. That is why now they have, in the recent NPC, they have introduced that Article 23, where people could be tried for sedition, etc., even on the mainland if it happens in Hong Kong. And it has also given the powers for the central government of China to establish organizations from, say, Ministry of State Security or anything else in Hong Kong as and when they feel it is required. So it is basically slowly and steadily tightening the controls over Hong Kong is what is happening. The second thing was on Taiwan. Taiwan, what happened when Hong Kong protests took place, it also played in favor of the present incumbent of Taiwan, that is Ms. Tsai Ing-wen. Earlier, when their popular rating was low, the Hong Kong issue came up and increased those popular ratings. She won handsomely in the elections, and she just got sworn in recently. So again, there have been issues related to Taiwan and mainland China. However, Xi Jinping will be able to project it in a manner that Hong Kong he has been able to control by bringing this law, etc., etc. But Taiwan is a different ballgame. So that he has to deal with differently. And I agree with Mr. Ranade to some extent in the sense that he is actually finding it difficult to handle Taiwan at this point in time.
All right. Talking about Taiwan and Hong Kong, Ambassador, for the time being at least, Taiwan seems to have cooled off because, it was the talk of town when the WHA was to take place, and, everyone was, the media was constantly speaking about it. Now, it seems like Hong Kong is the talk of town, and everyone, especially the West, is very concerned about what's happening in Hong Kong. What's likely to happen there?
Look, two thoughts come to me. First of all, the Chinese did show a degree of flexibility once the agitations began because they withdrew the legislation that was introduced in Hong Kong. But despite that, the protests in Hong Kong continued and they developed new dimensions. And that, I think, caused great alarm in Beijing, that it was now getting transformed, the agitation was getting transformed and perhaps was being supported by anti-China elements abroad. The second is that there was a feeling that the Chinese needed Hong Kong for the economic reason. I get the impression that they have come to the conclusion that if they have to suffer the consequences of their actions by Hong Kong getting less attractive as a global financial center, then so be it. But that is why they are tightening controls. So the alarm in China, uh, despite their initial flexibility, has been there, and the West as a whole has has increased this alarm because they are reminding the Chinese of the basic agreement that was under which Hong Kong reverted to the Chinese. Now, quite clearly, at the end of the day, if you see history, then this whole notion of one country, two systems cannot last. It has basic infirmities.
Okay, all right. So, Mr. Ranade, President Trump also, while addressing the media in a press conference, spoke about Hong Kong at length. He seems to be concerned. He's talking about it constantly. Is this at some level going to create major problems between the Chinese and the Americans?
It will be one more issue. There are already a series of issues that have come, starting with what has been, I say that, very cosmetically called the US-China trade war. It is actually a contest, between the two. The Americans recently brought out a paper called the US Strategic Approach to China, which was released, I think, just before the NPC one day earlier. Timing was, I think, done deliberately. That also virtually rules out engagement for engagement's sake and says that, we will talk only if there is something tangible that we have to discuss. So it is a hardening of posture that has happened consistently. On Hong Kong, what Trump has done, I understand it's through or he's made an announcement, is he's withdrawn the special facilities that have been extended to Hong Kong, which means that all the technology products and technology software or know-how that China used to get via Hong Kong and which China was denied if it went for it directly, now will come to a stop. But having said that, let me also say that China has made it explicit for a number of years that as far as matters of sovereignty and territorial integrity is concerned, that trumps everything else. It's number one. They made that clear to the Philippines, I think it was 2010. They made it clear to the Japanese, 2010, 2011, when they stopped the export of rare earths. And they made it clear to everyone else. In the context of our ongoing face-off or standoff, whatever we want to call it, in fact, when Alice Wells made that statement, echoing what Trump's offer of mediation as well as arbitration, I think that word arbitration was done more to irritate the Chinese, but still, that offer, there was a reaction from China. But that reaction wasn't very strident. The tough reaction actually came from the press counselor, I think she's a press counselor, but the counselor in the Chinese embassy here, who made a 3-sentence statement saying that we are firm in our determination to maintain our sovereignty. We are firm in our determination to maintain our territorial integrity. And we are firm in our determination to effect the reunification of China. But the last sentence is relevant when we look at the facts that they have made claims on Galwan, on Ladakh, on Sikkim. So, there is a pattern here, and That is how I'm looking at it, that their statements on these matters are very explicit. Similarly, on Hong Kong, what Vivek alluded to, that they went soft and then they became hard. There was a bit of a difference, I think, on what line to take. The Politburo Standing Committee member in charge of Hong Kong was not taking a very tough stance. Xi Jinping made a sort of a oblique critical remark on that also. But then there were rumors put out that Xi Jinping doesn't want to shed Chinese blood, which would happen if he moved in Hong Kong. But now, finally, it has come to that, and I quite agree that as far as the Chinese Communist Party is concerned and Xi Jinping is concerned, they will tighten the screws on Hong Kong. For them, I don't think life means very much.
Okay, time to get closing comments now from all my panelists with the best way forward. We'll talk about our standoff with China. General, as far as our standoff is concerned, where do you see this headed? Do you see any kind of a reprieve really as far as the tense situation we've noticed in Ladakh?
Okay, that's a good question. First thing is we need to understand that after the initial standoff that took place, where the injuries and all took place, thereafter things have quietened down even at the face-off spot. So what has happened is the daily meetings are taking place at the local commanders level. Two higher level military commanders meetings have taken place on 22nd and 23rd of May, and another meeting is expected soon. At the diplomatic levels also, the talks have been going on. You saw the kind of statements that came out of spokespersons of Beijing, both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Defense Ministry, and their ambassador here in Beijing, in Delhi. So all these things indicate that the initial aggressiveness that was there is actually slowing down at this point in time. That is point number one. Point number two is, we are very clear that we will maintain the territorial integrity and sovereignty of our country. We are not going to let go of anything related to that. Also, we are very sure that we will continue with the infrastructure development. But at the same time, we are also looking for a peaceful resolution to this and maintenance of peace and tranquility along the border, as was discussed in Wuhan summit as well as in Mamallapuram summit. So the way that I see it is, while we are firm in our commitment to defend the territorial integrity and sovereignty, we are also looking for a peaceful solution to this standoff. With the kind of talks that are going on, I can't predict how much time will it take. I hope it gets into a peaceful solution and then gets resolved.
Okay, all right. And Ambassador, what must diplomats do to defuse the situation?
Look, I think the first thing that needs to be ascertained is this. Have the Chinese changed facts on the ground? That is a question to which I must confess I don't have an answer, because the government has not indicated that as yet. And on that question depends everything else. Of course, there is no other alternative but to holding firm and to a peaceful solution. But this question is very significant, because if the Chinese have changed facts on the ground, then the question is, will our talks lead to the Chinese going back to status quo ante? On that, at least in my mind, there is no clarity as yet, because, and on that question depends really the future of India-China relations. I'm not stressing any adventurism, far from it. We've got to be very conservative. We've got to be patient, but yet firm. And this is a question that I think on which the general perhaps will be the best to give us a response.
Absolutely. All right. And Mr. Ranade, best way forward.
Well, I agree what Vivek said, that we have to be firm. There's no question of compromise. I think the general made that very clear. But then the question comes, why did the Chinese do it if they didn't want to do something, convey a message or occupy some territory? Now, when they're doing it in so many places, they must have maybe at least moved 10 steps forward, let me say, euphemistically. So that has to be sorted out. They have to go back. Status quo ante has to be restored, which means the diplomats now have an arduous job ahead of them. And I took a hint from what the general said. He probably doesn't like my taking the hint. But when he said he hopes it is settled soon, it means that he also anticipates that the talks could be arduous and possibly a bit protracted.
Okay, all right. And General, I'll let you have the last word on the program because both the other panelists have taken your names. So the floor is yours. Very quickly, your concluding remark on the program.
Just 30 seconds I'll take. First of all, our position at this point in time is that the Chinese are not on our side of the LAC. That is something that we are very clear about. The second thing is we will not allow our LAC's position to be altered in any form. So therefore, while I can't, like the other two panelists, esteemed panelists, I can't predict what time frame it will take. Whatever time frame it takes, we will ensure this, that we don't alter the status quo on ground, which was existing before, while in our territory, we continue to hold our right to construct the infrastructure as we deem fit and ensure that this issue is resolved peacefully, whatever time it takes.
Okay, all right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us.